every generation. Trial and storm, this has been our cornerstone. Our promise in the tempest, our life that breaks the darkness. No matter what comes, this will be our cornerstone, our cornerstone. For Christ was scorned and crucified, and Christ was dead and raised to life. Now death forever overthrown by Christ, our resurrection hope. He is our resurrection hope. Praise the risen Savior. Grave has lost its power. There's no fear in death. This is how the story ends. So lift a mighty chorus, a holy defiance. We will not be shaken. This is how the story ends. The story ends. For Christ was scorned and crucified, and Christ was dead and raised to life. Now death forever overthrown by Christ, our resurrection hope. He is our resurrection hope. Oh Christ, the victory. Death, where is your sting? Our head, the risen King. Death, where is your sting? Oh Christ, the victory. Death, where is your sting? Swallowed up in victory. For Christ was scorned and crucified, and Christ was dead and raised to life. Now death forever overthrown by Christ, our resurrection hope. And there's a day that's coming soon. The bride of Christ will see her groom. We'll live with him forevermore. Christ, our resurrection hope. He is our resurrection hope. He is our resurrection hope.
I just want to speak the name of Jesus over every heart and every mind. 'Cause I know there is peace within your presence. I speak Jesus. I just want to speak the name of Jesus every dark addiction starts to break. Declaring there is hope and there is freedom. I speak Jesus. Your name is power. Your name is healing. Your name is life. Break every stronghold. Shine through the shadow. Burn like a fire. I just want to speak the name of Jesus over fear and all anxiety. Every soul held captive by depression, I speak Jesus. Your name is power. Your name is healing. Your name is life. Break every stronghold. Shine through the shadow. Burn like a fire. Your name is power. Your name is healing. Your name is life. Break every stronghold. Shine through the shadow. Burn like a fire. Shout Jesus from the mountain, Jesus in the street, Jesus in the darkness over every enemy. Jesus for my family, I speak the holy name, Jesus. Shout Jesus from the mountain, Jesus in the street, Jesus in the darkness over every enemy. Jesus for my family, I speak the holy name, Jesus. Shout Jesus from the mountain, Jesus in the street, Jesus in the darkness over every enemy. Jesus for my family, I speak the holy name, Jesus. Your name is power. Your name is healing. Your name is life. Break every stronghold. Shine through the shadow. Burn like a fire. Your name is power. Your name is healing. Your name is life. Break every stronghold. Shine through the shadow. Burn like a fire. I just want to speak the name of Jesus over every heart and every mind. 'Cause I know there is peace within your presence. I speak Jesus.
When I say the word submission in relation to yourself, what do you initially think? Or what really just immediately builds up in your body? For myself, when I think of the idea of submitting to anybody or anything other than God, I immediately put my guard up. Because the truth is, for the most part, I don't want to submit to anybody or anything for any reason at any time. And yet, when we look at the writings of Paul in Ephesians, where we left off last week, he calls us to live out the spirit-filled life. And one of the markers of that spirit-filled life is to live in submission to one another out of reverence for Christ. That brothers and sisters in Christ are to live in submission to one another. And then Paul, what he's going to do, and what we're going to look at today, starting in chapter 5, verse 22, is look at how Paul's going to take that call to mutual submission and then apply it to the household. How do you take this idea of mutual submission and apply it to the closest, most intimate relationships in your life? The relationships in which you will experience the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. The relationships where you will win in life together, and you will also have some of the fiercest and ugliest arguments. How do you then take this call to mutual submission and apply it to a house where there is often a natural order in which people are submitting to each other? What does that look like? And that's what we're going to look at today. How does it look for husbands and wives, parents and children, masters and slaves, which is no longer directly applicable, but was part of their household? How do we live in mutual submission to one another? So starting in verse 22, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives, as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So he gives this call to what it is to live as Christ followers, as husbands of lives, summed up by the idea of wives submit to your husband, and husbands love your wife as Christ loved the church. And before we start diving into all of that and really looking at how that plays out, what I want to call to attention is a concern that I often see happen, that we take these commands and we make them dependent on the performance of the other person. What that looks like in practice is wives would say to their husbands, "Husband, I will submit to you only when you perfectly live out this call to love me as Christ loved the church." Or on the other hand, husbands would say to their wives, "Wife, I will love you as Christ loved the church only when you begin submitting to me." And when we do this, what we do is we turn this call instead into a transactional relationship where we're waiting for the other person to make the first step before we respond in the manner in which God has called us to. And instead, just like any other relationship, we need to be aware of our role and the other person's role and God's role. And the only responsibility that we can take is how we are going to live out our role, not how our spouse, our counterpart is going to live out their role, but only how we are going to live out our role. And the beauty of that is when we start to live out the role that we are called to in our marriage, what will often happen is the other person will naturally take the steps to living out their role as well. So let's dive into it. He starts off, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And Paul immediately calls to attention, and what we're going to get into is the structure of the household that God has in mind for husbands to lead the family and for wives to come behind their husbands, supporting them and following them, and as he says, submitting to them. And what I want to call into attention really quick, a couple of things in this statement that often get misused. First, it says, wives, submit to your own husbands. This call for wives to submit to their own husband exists within that one relationship and one relationship only. It does not at any point say, women, submit to all men. It says for one wife to submit to their one husband in the confines of marriage. And the second part that I've seen misused and twisted and bears repeating is when he says, as to the Lord. What does he mean as to the Lord? And what he's getting at is that he's not talking about the extent in which you submit to your husband, but instead the motive for why you would do so. He says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And how we would wrongly read this is, or translate this will be, wives, submit to your own husbands as though he were the Lord. Your husband, wives, is not your God. You have one God, the one true God, Christ Yahweh, and he is the only one who should be viewed as God. To view your husband as God, to submit to him as his God, is idolatry. And the proper reading of this, or another way to read this, is to say, wives, submit to your own husbands as service to the Lord, out of reverence to the Lord, right? The idea behind this is your motive for doing this is because it's what God calls you to, and to live within his will is good and pleasing to him. That following him in all ways, even when it's hard, even when you're called to submit, right, is pleasing to God. And he continues that idea, that motive in the next verse, verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. That God has designed the family with the husband as the head. And he points back to created order. He looks at Adam and Eve, and Adam was created first. And from that, God took Adam's rib, and then he creates Eve. And this isn't accidental. This is purposeful, and points to his desire for the family, that the order of creation matters, and it plays out in the family. And this would have been actually incredible for the people receiving this letter at the time, because they had a household code under Roman Empire, but that household code painted a very different motive for women to submit to their husbands. That was still the call, was for women to submit. But we would look at, let's say, the writings of Aristotle, and he talked about why would women be expected to submit to their husbands. And it wasn't about created order. It wasn't about just living according to God's will and his ways. But instead, what it would point to is the inferiority of women. That was what they had in mind when they called women to submit, that men were their superior in every way, that women were intellectually lacking and emotionally unstable and therefore unfit to lead. And it was only natural that women would follow their husband in all ways. And Paul completely flips that on his head, says, yes, continue to submit to the leadership of your husband, but it's not because you are inferior, right? Biblical headship has nothing to do with superiority or inferiority, but simply the created order of God. And then he goes on to say, now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husband. Now, I want to just clarify something here. The idea is, wives, you should follow your husband in all aspects, but whenever we're called to submit to anyone except God, there is exception. We are called to submit to each other. We're called to submit to the government. We're called to submit, wives to submit to husbands. And what is very clear as you look at the Bible as a whole, there are limits to that. In particular, if you are called to sin, you are not to follow in regards to that. You serve, yes, a higher master, God, and any time that you are called or led outside of his confines and his boundaries, that is a no-go. You are not expected to follow into that. So even though he says everything, there are limits to this. Now, looking at this call for wives to submit to your husbands, right? For some of you, maybe you're newer to the church. You come from a culture that maybe embodied this for different reasons, and this may be something easy for you to accept. Or for some of you, may be part of a culture or subculture within the United States that very much rejects any idea of submission, even in the household. And what I would point to is when you see this modeled well, it's beautiful, and it leads to the flourishing of both people in the household, husbands and wives. And in particular, hold on, because the second part of it really paints not a tyrannical leadership, but a loving, self-sacrificing leadership. And for wives, if you're in the church and you're saying, man, this is what I want for my household, I would love for my husband to lead, and I would love to submit to his leadership. Here's what I would challenge for you. Are you leadable? Are you leadable? Are you willing to actually submit? If you want your husband to take on leadership of the household, are you willing to allow him to lead? That means when he makes a decision or he points your family in a direction, do you willingly follow, or do you make it as miserable as possible, questioning every decision, belittling it, explaining how your plan is better and smarter and wiser, and that he's too unfit to lead? Do you demean him in private or in public and mock his leadership? If you're doing those things, the reality is your husband will not want to lead. Nobody wants to lead somebody who does not want to follow. So if you desire this in your marriage, your role then would be to look at yourselves and say, am I actually willing to follow in this? And do I need to soften my heart to follow him and allow him to lead, even if maybe at this point he's not the greatest leader? As this developed in my household, the reality was I look back at it and I love how my wife was willing to allow me to be the leader of the house and follow me, but I did some things terribly and that I regret. And gracefully, Jamie came behind me and supported me in growing in that relationship. Now he takes this and then he's going to move on to husbands, right? Husbands, you have a big call as well. Maybe an even more difficult call. He says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So your leadership, husbands, is to look like this, is to look like how Christ loved the church. And the perfect example of what Christ did to love the church was he went to the cross, suffered greatly, took upon the sins of the world, and died so people could have new life, right? That's what he did. He sacrificed of himself so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So Christ leads the church by sacrificing himself for the church so that so that the church can flourish. And husbands, you were not going to lead to the flourishing of your wife, like verses 26 and 27. You will not make her holy. You do not make her without blemish. This is what Christ does for the church. But just like that, our desire in leadership should be to live self-sacrificially, to be servant leaders who are concerned primarily not with our own desires, but with the flourishing of our wives. So as you lead your household, as you lead your wife, is that first and foremost what you take every decision, every movement of your household? Do you filter it through that? That is this for the flourishing of my wife? Because if we go ahead and we're leading our family with what am I going to get out of it, we are distorting the call on our life as head of the household. He says, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. That this is the level of which we should view our marriage. This is not two people living together in opposition, trying to make things work, although sometimes it feels like that. But we should be loving our wives just as like we would want to be treated. As we are leading, we shouldn't be leading them, subjugating them, pushing them down, lifting ourselves up only, but view them as if I wanted to be treated this way, this is how I'm going to treat my wife. He takes it a step further. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That the reality for marriage is it's not just two people kind of affiliated, going through life, united by a contract that we can break at any time, but instead, the level of which we are united is two becoming one flesh. Now, this is a spiritual reality, not a physical one. Clearly, my wife and I are not conjoined twins, but that is how we should view all things. That everything I do in my marriage, that I do to my wife, I am also doing to myself. So when we enter into a disagreement, an argument, and right, the nature of disagreement or arguments is that I want to win, which means my wife has to lose. And when I'm really being just out of control, not a good person, right? Maybe I just want my wife to lose. And that mindset that we can carry into an argument is in violation of what God has made us. There is no such thing as in a marriage for me to win and my wife to lose. If my wife loses, we are one flesh, therefore I lose. Do you view the way you interact with your life in that mindset that you can only win together or lose together? There is no separation. And he paints this picture about the severity, the seriousness God has for this covenant of marriage. That there is no breaking apart of marriage in which both parties are not seriously, grievously wounded, to divorce your wife, even or to enter into divorce on any level, is to hack apart part of your own body, part of your own flesh, that both parties will leave seriously hurt. And it's the level at which God calls us to cherish our marriage, is that you have become one and to see yourselves as one. He goes on to this idea. He said, this mystery is profound. And I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, like that to Christ and the church, that our marriage actually has an example that we're laying out for the people around us. It is to paint a picture of what Christ has done for his church. That is, that he has pursued an imperfect people group who do not deserve it to the cross. And we are to live in our marriages the same way, as two imperfect people pursuing one another despite all of our flaws and arguments and disagreements for life. He ends this passage, he says, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Before we move on to the second part of the household code, I just want to leave us with this plug for marriage team, that we take marriages very serious here. We want to see your marriage thrive. But the reality is that marriages can be very, very difficult at times. And this is a resource that we offer. It's coaching. It is not counseling, but coaching. And it really walks through communication and conflict resolution. And if this is something that you think would be helpful for you, want to point you at this ministry that we have at the church and in the area, and that this is an opportunity to meet with other congregants who will walk you through these strategies. Next up, starting Ephesians 6:1, he addresses now the second part of the household code, which is children and parents. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So now he moves on to the second part of the household code, the relationship between parents and children. How do we now live, as he said in chapter 5, in mutual submission to one another? Which is very difficult in this relationship, because the nature of parents and children is that children are going to be living in submission to their parents, or at the very least should be, as we know doesn't always take place. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. That is the natural order of the household. Parents are to follow the instruction and the guidance and the rearing of their parents. Just this couple weeks ago, my son, after I'd asked him to clean his room, said, "Dad, you're not my boss." To which I kind of subdued laughter and said to him very seriously, "Son, that is exactly what I am. I am your boss." From a biblical and a legal perspective, that is our role with our children. And the call from God is that children submit to that natural order and obey their parents. Now, he in there, once again, lays out the motivation for doing this. It has nothing to do with the skill of your parents and their ability to parent you, but simply because this is the natural order that God has created. So children, whatever your age, your following of your parents is something that the Lord delights in. And he wants you to do it regardless of whether your parents are incredible at it, because the reality that all parents come to at some point is there are times where we are really, really just not great at this. It is a learning experience for us. And no matter how many classes we take, right, the reality is no person has ever raised you at your age before. And there are principles and ideas out there, but every situation is unique. And we are parenting often on the fly. So my encouragement to you would be to have grace for your parents, because one day you will be in the same situation and you will understand. So he says, children, obey your parents. And then he goes on to say, you're to submit to their leadership, but you are also to honor them. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. That God talks about. This comes from one of the 10 Commandments. And he talks about how it's a promise that under the 10 Commandments, God would bless the children who would follow them, that they would prosper because of it. But there's just a simple reality there. As you follow your father and mother, as they parent you, and the instruction of the Lord, as we'll see, the reality is the natural byproduct of that is it will go well for you as you follow their proper parenting. Now, this honor piece simply just means to show them respect and dignity and to love them and care for them. Now, the question that I wanted to go to is how do we then take this for myself? As an adult child, right? I still have parents, even though I'm 40 years old. And how do I then take this command and apply it to my life today? Because the reality is this call to obey, to submit to them as the authority of my life has gone away. I have left the household. I have married my wife. I have my own family. So this part of it kind of really diminishes, but this call to honoring your father and mother stays. That I am still called to honor them because of their role, because of what they have done, to treat them with dignity and respect. So how do we do that well? One of the things I would say is it's not wrong to have boundaries. In fact, it's appropriate to have boundaries as well as respect the boundaries of your parents. That we can have those boundaries. We don't have to submit to them as though they have full authority over us anymore. That's okay to uphold that boundary, but continue to honor them. So how do we do that well? One of the things I would point to as they start to age and need support from you, whether that's physical support, maybe financial support, that we would be willing to do that. That it's pleasing to God when we care for the ones who have raised us, to honor them by taking time out of our schedule or maybe money out of our pocketbook to provide for them as they need. Another way we can honor them, one of the ways that I struggle with greatly, is just pick up the phone and call them. I live 6 hours from my parents. I don't get to see them face to face very often, but it's important that I honor them by showing that I still value the relationship, that I'm still invested in them, that I'm still making a conscious effort to stay in communication with them. So we are still called to honor them as we can. The second half of this, though, he gets to, right, then the parents. How do we as parents live out this call to mutual submission when we have authority over our children? And he says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That we are to discipline and instruct our children to the Lord. Now, he starts this verse off with fathers. Now, everything I'm going to say is applicable to fathers as well as to mothers, but he highlights fathers here for a very big reason. Under the Roman household code, fathers were very distant figures. Right? They were the ultimate authority in the house, but raising children was often left to the mother or to servants. And they would raise children from afar. They would kind of set the program in which they would be raised under. They would discipline them, especially when things got bad. But by and large, fathers were fairly hands off. And what Paul does, what God does, is he calls fathers and says, no, you have a role in the raising of your children, and you are to have a hands-on, present role in their upbringing. He says you are not to just pass this off to other people, but you are to have a direct role. You are to discipline, provide discipline and instruction to them. So we are to instruct them, fathers and mothers. We are to instruct our children. And he points to the primary instruction, or at least the most important instruction, is to understand the Lord, to know him, to know his ways, to know his will, to follow him fully. That is the primary instruction we are to give our children. That is our primary role in raising them. Right? There are a lot of things that we can instruct our children to. I teach my children about math and English and science and social studies, help them in their schooling. I train them about sports and physical activities, how to throw a ball, how to ride a bike, how to swim. I'm teaching my kids, right, how to change oil and work on the house. And all of those are well and good, but they are to come second to raising them to know and love God. And he says, you're not just to give them instruction, to just teach them with word, but you are to discipline them as well. That a parent who does not discipline their child is a parent who does not love their child. Part of our role is to teach them, right, with hands-on instruction, right, to correct their actions as they veer off course, to point them back to truth. We are to discipline our children. Right? Laissez-faire parenting, this idea of just, I'm going to let my children go run amok and do whatever they want and they're going to figure it out on their own, is not biblical. Right? There are times we need to let our children experience the world, but we are also to discipline them and instruct them. Now, what's so interesting about this is he talks about discipline, but he starts off with this idea, do not provoke your children to anger. As we parent our children, we need to keep in mind that as we are disciplining them, our goal is to discipline them, but not be a harsh disciplinarian. that we are, yes, to be parents and not their best friend, but at the same time, we are to parent them without destroying relationship with them. That if we're disciplining them harshly, what we are doing is not building them up towards God, but driving them away from ourselves and from ultimately God. That we need to maintain a balancing act of holding them accountable and showing them grace, of being stern with them and holding them to a high level of behavior, but also being loving to them. And I think part of why he highlights fathers in this is because often I think fathers, in my experience, struggle with this more often than mothers. We can be very good on the discipline aspect and very stern on it, but we can be too harsh to our children, where the point where that discipline no longer leads them to corrective behavior, but instead just anger. And so we have to maintain that balance. One of the ways we do that, Jamie and I, we've practiced love and logic throughout our entire time parenting. And in it, there's this idea of how we discipline our children is that we do not discipline them so that we're punishing them, right? When we punish them, what we're doing is we want them to pay for what they have done so that we can feel better. Instead, we discipline them to consequences, that our job is to point them to that their behavior, whether good or bad, leads to a logical consequence. That if they have good behavior, they'll receive a good consequence naturally, and a poor behavior, they'll receive a poor consequence, right? So we are pointing them to just the reality of the world. As you behave poorly, you're going to have natural consequences, because when they get out into the real world, poor behavior, and especially criminal poor behavior, will lead them to jail. And so we want to make those connections so that we're not pointing them back to our anger, maybe at their disobedience, but instead just the reality of life in there. The second thing I would say about this, how do we do discipline them and not provoke them to anger, is accept the fact that we are flawed human beings. And there are times when we will not live this out well, right? Parenting is hard. We have real emotions. Our kids do things that drive us up the wall sometimes. And that when we find ourselves disciplining them and instructing them in a way that provokes them to anger, we need to be big enough to just apologize, to be honest with our kids that I lost my temper. I yelled at you. I did something wrong. Even though you were in the wrong, so was I, and seek to repair a relationship. So he's gone through these two relationships within the household code, how we go about living them out. And then he's going to move to the third one. And for this one's a little bit odd for us because it doesn't exist for us anymore. Or I should say it should not exist for us anymore, because he's going to talk about masters and slaves. He says, bondservants, which is another word for slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ. Not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him. So he's going to address what was a very common part of the Roman household, which was slaves and masters. At this time of his writing, slavery was legal and it was widespread. From what I can tell from scholars, there somewhere between 30 to 50% of all people in the Roman Empire at the time of Paul's writings were slaves. So somewhere between 60 and 90 million people were slaves. And then there's another estimate that another third of the population at the time, so another 60 million people, were former slaves in the Roman Empire. This was just widespread, and most households had at least one slave or servant within there. And so this was a very common relationship that most people interacted with. But before we jump into his instruction for them, I want to address a couple things, because when we start talking about slavery, right, it brings some feelings and emotions out of us that can get in the way of our understanding of the passage. One of those is this, right? We will immediately make this jump to the American slavery, that we have a troubled past with slavery and the treatment of Black people in our country. And we will immediately apply to this and say, right, we will just immediately make this connection to what Paul's talking about and pointing out is racism. And what I would say about this is that their form of slavery, while disgusting in many ways, had nothing to do with racism. Anybody at any point in the Roman Empire could become a slave. It did not matter your nationality, your religion, your race. Anybody could be a slave at any point in time. This had nothing to do with racism. That's not to say it was good, but that idea of racism attached to what Paul is teaching does not exist. And the second part is a lot of people read this and say, right, this is, well, the pushback on the Bible. See, it just promotes slavery, right? And I would actually argue that Paul does not promote slavery at all. What he's writing about is his concern is how are you going to act as a Christ follower, as spirit-filled in the midst of whatever situation you are in, whether you are free or a slave. And that is what he is concerned with. And in fact, beyond that, you can make a very strong argument that Paul is subverting the institution of slavery with the desire to see it undone. And that's how God often always works. He doesn't often tear down, right, human institutions that are wicked or evil in his writings, but instead points us to how we are going to change our hearts within them so that they naturally fall away. So he goes on, right, in his writing. He calls bondservants to continue to live according to your station. You are a slave, you have a master, you are expected to obey them. You can, right, you can suffer greatly if you don't obey them. And it was very dehumanizing, by the way. Slaves were allowed to be beaten, sexually abused. There were even writings that suggest that slaves could be executed if they disobeyed their masters. And Paul says you are to continue living according to this situation you are in. You are to follow them and obey them. But what he gets at is, again, this motivation for it. Rendering service with a good will is to the Lord and not to man. That you are doing this not because it's a good situation that you're in, not because your master deserves your slavery, but instead, right, that you are following the ways of God. And in this kind of goes back to what we looked at last week when Paul wrote that we were darkness and exposed to the light of Jesus and now have become the light in a dark world. And as you live honorably, as you work hard, as you obey your master, you are living differently than the people around you. You are being a light in this dark situation and that you are advancing the gospel by your behavior. And that's really Paul's motivation for the slaves found in this situation. That behave honorably, work hard, not because you need to gain the favor of them so that you look good, but that you can paint a favorable light for Jesus in this situation. He goes on in verse 8 to say, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord. He paints to them, though, as you do this, you will not receive an earthly reward. You are going to be mistreated, but you can trust in God because he is storing up treasure for you in heaven because of your good behavior, that your Father in heaven will reward you. Now, then he goes to masters, right? And he writes something very, very contrary to the other idea at the time. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening. Right? Do the same to them. Act as I have called your slaves to act honorably and respectfully and work hard. You, masters, are to do the exact same thing. And beyond that, you are to stop your threatening. This practice of abuse is not acceptable. You're not to go on doing it. You are to treat them with dignity. And he goes to this idea that knowing that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven and that there is no partiality with him. He points to this spiritual reality. On earth, masters, you are treated as the superior human being, that you are a person with full rights and they are your property and that they are inferior to you. But in the eyes of God, there's no such thing. In fact, what he's really getting at with this word master is the idea that spiritually you were a slave to sin and death and Satan, and you have been bought at a price by Christ, and now you still exist as a slave, but you exist as a slave to Christ, in which you have true freedom. And when God looks at you, he doesn't see you through human eyes. He doesn't look at you as superior or inferior. He looks at you as equals. There's no partiality with God. And therefore, you should act the same as God. This is where he's undermining slavery and where it would naturally lead to the dissolution of it, right? That you are to view them as equals with you, not as property, but as equals, just as God views you as equals. Now, what do we do with this passage? Because right, in America, slavery is illegal. No one should be enslaved. Unfortunately, there's a reality that human trafficking does still exist. This is not what's at stake here. This is not what he's talking about. Paul condemns in his other writers enslavers at all. But What do we do? How do we apply this to our lives? One of the things that I've seen over the years is people make a jump from this. They'll say, right, this is, all right, masters and slaves directly implies to employers and employees, right? And while I think there is some application there, I want us to be very aware that there is no direct jump there. In their situation, slaves were the full property of their masters. There was no immediate freedom. They could buy their freedom, but while they were slaves, they were expected to obey every demand of their master in every aspect of their life. That is not true in our employee-employer relationships today, right? If you decide you don't like your employer, you don't want to work for them anymore, they're asking you to do something that you don't want to do, ultimately, you can leave. You can resign from your position. I'm not saying that won't have consequences, not getting a paycheck, but you can leave. So there is not a one-to-one application here. So what do we do with it? I want to point to really two things. One, as an employee, we should embody the mindset that Paul has written to slaves, that we are to be hard, diligent workers, that we are to work with integrity. We are to work in a way in sight of God and not even our employers first and foremost. That and what the Bible paints is that diligent work is pleasing to the Lord, and we should work in such a way as unto him and not to man. So what that means is this idea that we see sometimes that's right, that it's honorable somehow to cut corners, to slack off when our bosses aren't working is not a biblical model. We are called to be hardworking people of integrity. And for employers, right? One, the obvious one, your employees are not your slaves, and that they are your equals from a spiritual perspective and should be treated as such. Yes, you have authority over them at some level, but you should be treating them with dignity and respect as all people deserve. We're taking a look at this household code. I'm going to go ahead and release the campus pastors. Love you guys. We're on week 10 of our abiding practice of community. And today, what we'd ask is you would evaluate your community in light of the mission of God, of the call of us to be disciples of God, making disciples of God. How do you see that expressed in your community? Are you doing that with one another? Is there an outside group that you are working together or maybe individually to serve as you make disciples?